Hello, Western Civ 2 students. So we had talked about the Jimmy Carter years, and I pointed out that the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter was president from January of 77 to January of 81, saw a continuation of the stagflation, a stagnant economy with high inflation. In fact, remarkably high inflation, pushing 20% at times. That, of course, drives up interest rates if you want to borrow money. It was a very negative economic environment. That would be one of the major things shaping the election of 1980. Others would be humiliations on the world stage. The Cold War is still very much on. We had been pushed out of Vietnam. Realistically, that's what happened. We lost Vietnam 7 years earlier. And then Vietnam fell, South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam, and we did nothing to stop it in 1975. That was a humiliation. That wasn't on Jimmy Carter's watch. He certainly doesn't get the blame for that. But two things that did happen, and I know I talked about both of them last time. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union would invade Afghanistan, and the United States could not effectively do much of anything about that. We did boycott the 1980 Olympics, which are being held in Moscow. But other than that, not much could be done by the United States about this invasion of a neighboring country by the Soviet Union. And far more damaging for Jimmy Carter, American diplomats were seized and held hostage by the by students loyal to the Iranian government. And the Iranian government gave them every encouragement. So it was practically the same as if the Iranian government were holding them hostage. All this happened. The last 444 days of Jimmy Carter's presidency was overshadowed by the Iran hostage crisis. So that's all on the table. Bad economy, humiliations abroad, and the energy crisis was still ongoing. OPEC still forcing oil prices high, gasoline shortages. Jimmy Carter gave, frankly, some rather depressing speeches to the nation, talking about how desperate the energy situation was. This is something else I feel I must tell you. I was a middle school student, a junior high student in this period. And I remember vividly being told that we would be out of oil. The world would run out of oil by the year 2000. So, yeah, you can't always look in a crystal ball and know the future. Not only has that not happened, the world is practically sloshing with oil now thanks to fracking. The price of oil has dropped to practically nothing a couple of weeks ago. But in any event, all those things led to very negative feelings by a lot of people towards Jimmy Carter. The Republican candidate who would run against him in 1980 was Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, former Hollywood actor. He was probably what one would call a B-list actor, a very good actor, but not among the very best. Not one of the great stars of Hollywood, but he had some good roles. He got nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for King's Row. He had a very memorable role as George Gipp in Newt Rockney All-American and a few other movies that were pretty good. So he had a successful second-tier acting career in Hollywood before going into politics in the 1960s when he won the governorship of California. He got a reputation as a very conservative Republican. And some of the things he did were controversial. For example, you remember I talked to you about in the late 60s, student activists sometimes seized campus buildings in the late 1960s. At the University of California at Berkeley, a very liberal campus, a group of students seized one of the major buildings on campus. And Ronald Reagan, the governor, sent the National Guard in to drive them out. So you had, combat-armed National Guardsmen going onto campuses. Thank goodness nobody got injured, but they were driven off by the National Guard. Now, that divided Californians. A lot of Californians liked this forceful attitude, not putting up with this stuff, and he got praised by many conservative Californians and vilified by many liberal Californians. And this kind of reputation went with Ronald Reagan into the presidential election. There was also his close association in 1964's election with Barry Goldwater, one of the fiercest of all Cold Warrior conservatives ever. Very implacable foe of the Soviet Union. And most people assumed Reagan would carry the same attitudes about the Cold War and the Soviet Union into the campaign. So you have a not popular president with all kinds of problems, but the Republican nominee is seen by some as kind of an extreme right-winger. So that was the election of 1980. And Ronald Reagan won that election. He did win that election, not by a landslide, though. It was a close election in 1980. And again, I think part of that was just there were people who were worried that Ronald Reagan was too conservative. And when he took office, he began to reshape American politics. You cannot understand American politics since 1980 without understanding Ronald Reagan. He would leave office one of the most popular presidents of the era. He would be seen as the man who helped to win the Cold War, played a major role in driving the Soviet Union out of existence. He would leave office a couple of years before the Soviet Union disappeared from the scene, but his policies were probably the crucial ones that caused the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan's policies would lead to a greatly expanded United States military. So after the humiliation of losing Vietnam and being too weak to do very much of anything against the Soviet Union in the 70s, the United States could walk with, some swagger on the world stage at the end of Ronald Reagan's time, because our military was much stronger. Also, an economy which had been very weak in the 70s, went into recession as soon as Ronald Reagan became president, would end the time, Reagan's time in office, roaring along. Huge expansion. The most of the 1980s was a period of great economic prosperity. And all this has led to Ronald Reagan being considered very positively. So how did things go from being a man that some people were scared of in 1980 to leaving office a generally quite popular president? Not to say everybody did. There's no politician that everybody approves of, but generally getting high marks from many Americans. In fact, 1984, he would win in a landslide over Walter Mondale. One of the greatest victories in American political history was Ronald Reagan's triumph over Walter Mondale. So what happened? Well, on domestic issues, Ronald Reagan promised a revolution, the Reagan Revolution. At its very heart was the idea that the federal government had grown too big, was too powerful, spent too much money, and too many Americans were dependent upon the federal government. They should be more self-reliant. So Reagan promised to shrink parts of the United States government, to cut taxes, and to reduce regulation. He helped to change attitudes for many Americans about the federal government. I mean, the New Deal had been one where you expected the federal government to come in and help. The Great Society of Lyndon Johnson had been an idea that the government could help to make America a great society. Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, kind of had a flipped attitude of that. He said one of the scariest phrases in the English language is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." He wanted government to be smaller, less intrusive in people's lives, for people to stand more on their own feet, to keep more of their own money. And these principles have permeated Republican thinking in America ever since. Donald Trump is a different kind of Republican than Ronald Reagan, but at its basic level, most of that still survives, even today, 40 years later. Now, the first years of Ronald Reagan in office were definitely controversial. For one thing, in a time where people were worried the federal government may not have enough money to pay its bills, one of Reagan's first steps was a tax cut, a cut in taxes. There were people who said, we can't do that, it'll drive up the budget deficit. But Reagan subscribed to what was known as supply-side economics. Critics would call it trickle-down economics. But the idea, if we cut taxes, people have more money in their pockets, they will spend that as consumers, and that will drive the economy forward. After all, 68% of the American economy is based on consumer spending. If consumers have more money, they drive the economy, they buy stuff, which causes factories to make stuff, which causes people to hire people, which causes more things to be made that are less expensive, and more people can buy them, and it's a virtuous cycle in theory. Because the economy is roaring, even at the lower tax rate, the tax revenue is supposed to go up. That's the theory. I must tell you that part did not happen. Tax revenues did not go up. So that part of supply-side economics didn't prove to be accurate. Budget deficits did go up and tax revenues didn't. But on the other hand, the theory about the consumer spending worked great. The economy did begin to roar. Now, Reagan wanted reductions in the size of the government. And some aspects of social spending, welfare spending, were actually cut. Now, this was a period of recession, so this was very controversial. You could turn on the news, many stories about homeless people sleeping in the street, things like that, lines at the unemployment office. That was very much on people's minds. But Reagan wanted even welfare spending to be reduced. He wanted the government to spend less money, be less intrusive into people's lives. That was his principles. And so he did this, and this was controversial. But as the economy began to roar, unemployment goes down. Homelessness never disappears, but by 1983, the recession is over, and the economy's starting to pick up, and you get less and less comment on those kind of issues. So there was a kind of a change on the part of many middle-class Americans' attitudes. Maybe the government has been too intrusive in people's lives. I must say, though, part of the reason the economy roared was that defense spending I told you about. Reagan began to greatly expand the size of our military, to greatly improve the quality of the equipment they had, and that cost money. Now, it didn't mean ballooning deficits. We had cut taxes, we have less money coming in the coffers, but we're spending a whole lot more on the military. But again, most Americans were willing to take the deficit spending because they thought it was important to build the military. And it will prove to be part of what wins the Cold War. Again, the military greatly expanded. The Navy had 600 ships in it by the time Reagan left office, or nearly 600. Hugely expanded, like nearly doubled in size in the 1980s. Top-notch fighters and bombers, and very much improved military. And the few military adventures we had in the Caribbean, showed that it could fight and it could win. So these are part of the reasons Reagan would leave office with a positive reputation in many Americans' minds. A booming economy, America's respect on the world stage largely restored, and his philosophy of reducing the size of the federal government, making people less dependent on it, did win a lot of converts. As I said, 1984, former Vice President Walter Mondale would be the Democratic nominee, but it was not a contest. The only real problem Reagan had going into that election, with a good economy, positive views on most things, there were people who were worried about his age. Ronald Reagan had been 70 when he was elected, when he became president. So he was 74. And at that time, that made him the oldest president we had ever had. And there were people who thought 74 might be too old to be electing a president. He'd be 78 when he left office. And that was an issue. And the first debate between Mondale and Reagan did seem a little confused, a little stammering a few times. There were people who began to worry that maybe he was losing it. But in the second debate, he didn't cram as much information into his head. He stuck to a smaller amount of material to master, and he did a much better with it. But he also had what has got to be one of the greatest joke lines in American political history. Walter Mondale was a man in his 60s himself, a man who had been a senator for decades and the vice president of the United States for 4 years. You could not get a more qualified person to run for president, at least on paper, than Walter Mondale had been. Nobody could question that. But Reagan was asked about his age by one of the moderators. What do you say to people who are worried about that? And Reagan said, I want to say right now that I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I will not comment on my opponent's youth and inexperience. And it brought down the house with laughter. I just had to mention that because, and some people say that's when the probability he'd win became a landslide. That wit was so, even Mondale was laughing like crazy at it because, obviously he's highly qualified. He's not youthful or inexperienced. He's younger than Reagan. But that laugh line. We'll talk in the next lecture about the Cold War, because if there were a couple of things in the early part of Reagan's presidency that people worried about, there were plenty of people who thought he was maybe a little dangerous on the Cold War. During the campaign, just to give you a taste, he had been sitting waiting for a debate to start in Nashua, New Hampshire, the first primary state. And he was waiting on the other Republican candidates to get in their chairs, and they were doing a mic check, check on the microphone. And Reagan said jokingly, the planes are in the air, they'll be bombing in 5 minutes. And he was joking because people thought he might be a hothead who'd get us into war. But the fact that he did that, it was on camera and it got all over the news, it looked bad. And when Ronald Reagan became president, he did use some pretty strong language about the Soviet Union. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Now, this was, a few years after Star Wars, so everybody's thinking about like Darth Vader and the evil empire. But, so that early rhetoric about the Soviet Union and the like did cause people to worry. But Reagan will leave office having negotiated major arms control treaties and having a more positive relationship with the Soviet Union's leader than any American president before. It's fascinating, and that'll be the topic of our next lecture. Take care.